Hello, this is Charles Brewer, President of the Civil War Study Group here at Lake of the Woods, Virginia. Welcome to the recording of our program on November 22nd, 2024. Our speaker today is Shannon Doherty. Did I pronounce Doherty right? Okay, good. Whose presentation is titled, They Came From Over the River. Shannon is a native of New York and graduated from the State University of New York at Binghamton. She interned with the National Park Service at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park, with which we're very familiar. Before joining Historic Germanna Foundation just down the street, she was an NPS, National Park Service Pathways Park Guide at Fort Pulaski National Monument near Savannah, Georgia. At Germanna Foundation, she is the education manager. So please welcome Shannon.
Hi everybody, can everyone hear me okay? Okay, there's no mic, so I'm going to try to project. Thank you for having me back. I was supposed to be here in July, but I caught COVID pretty badly, and so I didn't want to share that with everybody. So I hope you appreciate that. But thank you for being flexible and having me back, because I'm super excited to share my research here. Kind of as part of my job as the education manager, I do some research on the side to kind of grow our knowledge and then our programs on our historic sites. For people who don't know, I'm with Historic Germanna, which is right down the road on Route 3. We steward a bunch of different sites. We have our visitor center, our archaeology center. We have an active archaeology site. And we also steward an 18th century plantation house in Culpeper County, which is what I'm really going to be talking about today. It's called Salubria. If you haven't been there, we're typically open by appointment during the more hospitable months of the year. So basically from April to November, you can call us, schedule a tour. We're also open for various events, so just keep an eye out on our website and stuff, because we'd love to have you out there. It's a really unique site, has some really unique stories, just one of which I'm going to be talking about today. I actually gave this a version of this presentation almost a year ago. We did an event at Salubria to commemorate the 160th anniversary of the winter encampment of the Union Army in Culpeper. But since then, this presentation has kind of grown and developed. I've uncovered some new information, some new facets to this story, and so it's really been fleshed out since then. I also do want to acknowledge that this is my research, and that there are still a lot of holes in the story that I'm trying to piece together, so any omissions, I just ask that you humbly forgive me for them. So, why don't we get started, and I'm going to start with a story of a man named John. He was born in 1821 in Prince William County. He was enslaved, known as Osborne by his enslaver, Robert Grayson. By the time he was 33 years old, he was described as being very stout, stood about 5 feet 9 inches tall. He had very bad teeth and had a hernia in his right side. In the early 1850s, Robert Grayson died. His son, also known as Robert Grayson, becomes John's new enslaver. In 1853, at 24 years old, Robert purchases Salubria. He forcibly relocates John to Salubria, as well as other enslaved individuals, from his father's plantation in Prince William to Salubria in Culpeper County. The next year, pressed for cash, Robert hires John out to a nearby plantation in Orange County. And at some point during this time, John will marry a woman enslaved by Coleman Beckham at Ashland Farm, which is near Salubria as well. On September 27, 1854, John ran away. Robert goes through lengths to recapture him, offering a $100 reward and publishing leaflets like the one you see here, advertising in local newspapers. These advertisements advise potential traffickers, if you will, of the location of John's wife and mother. And ironically, we know a lot about these enslaved individuals because of these advertisements. They give us very detailed descriptions of the people, of their relations, and that's why we know about John. Unfortunately, we don't know what ended up happening to John. We don't know if he successfully ran away, he linked up with his wife. We don't know. Because in a few months, the advertisements were disappearing from the newspapers. But I only talk about this little story because John's situation, which is a forced relocation and the subsequent self-emancipation, are only a timely prelude of what is to come to Salubria, to Culpeper County, to Central Virginia, and to large portions of the South during the Civil War. Salubria's experience during the Civil War illustrates the changing nature of emancipation on the ground in Central Virginia. But before we really dive into that, we're going to go back in time, get a little bit of context. In 1749, Culpeper County was formed out of Orange County. Initially, tobacco was the staple crop of Virginia. In the Piedmont region, by the mid-18th century, this gave way to wheat and corn as tobacco depleted the soils and prices dropped around the time of the American Revolution. It was around this period that Salubria was constructed. We date the house to about 1757. Culpeper, on account of this wheat and corn growth, became very prosperous. Of course, the enslaved labor force was also growing as well with each passing year. In 1790, Culpeper had one of the largest enslaved populations in Virginia. And by 1860, fully half of Culpeper County's 12,000 people were enslaved. So that's about 50%. Wheat and corn, of course, continued to be profitable, with just under 500,000 bushels of corn being produced in 1860. And so that brings us to a little bit before 1853, when Robert Grayson purchases Salubria. And this is a late 19th century photograph of the house. This is the earliest photograph we have that we know of. He purchased the house and about 400 acres from the Hansborough family. Robert Grayson is 24 years old. He is 5 feet, 7 feet, 7.5 inches tall with a light complexion, red hair, and blue eyes. As will kind of become a common theme throughout his ownership and this presentation, Robert Grayson's finances are often in disarray. I'm about the same age as Robert Grayson, and my finances are also often in disarray. So I do relate to that. He pays for Salubria in installments, though I have not gotten to the point of buying a house of 400 acres, so he is one up on me. But he pays for it in installments, which end up not being paid on time. It isn't until 1861 when he finally gets full ownership of Salubria, thanks to a loan from his brother and his mother's estate. Who actually, his mother Sarah passes away the same year, so it ends up coming from her estate. But family drama isn't the only thing that Robert Grayson is dealing with during this time frame. As you may know, in 1860, there was a very contentious presidential election. It pitted 4 different candidates against each other. Abraham Lincoln, of course, we know represents the Republican Party on the platform of opposing expansion of slavery. John Breckinridge represents the southern wing of the Democratic Party, while Stephen Douglas represents the northern, more mainstream wing of the Democrats. And a fourth option, which campaigns on compromise and union and devotion to the Constitution, was John Bell of the aptly named Constitutional Union Party. So I have this map of how Virginia voted in 1860, kind of divvied up by county, and I have Culpeper County, maybe I can use the pointer, yeah, circled in red here, and you can see that they voted for Bell, which honestly surprised me, because Culpeper is surrounded by all of these heavily Breckinridge counties, and so that shows that they were kind of leery about war, leery about disunion. They voted by a margin of 1 vote for Bell in the Constitutional Party. So a little bit more than a majority, but that still shows that there's a hesitance to war. But things quickly fall apart after that. Lincoln ultimately wins the election, as we know, and Culpeper's tentative resolve to cling to the Union was overwhelmed by anger towards the Republican president-elect, who threatened a lot of their current way of life. The Culpeper militia, which became famous during the Revolutionary War, the Culpeper Minutemen, they reorganize, a new generation of Culpeper Minutemen reorganize in Brill. Early in 1861, there's another hearkening back to revolutionary times. Culpeper citizens draft a series of resolutions, one of which resolved that every slave state should secede before the 4th of March next, which March 4th is Inauguration Day. So this is kind of what's going on in Culpeper. The secession furor is only going to grow. James Barber, who's kind of a prominent citizen of Culpeper County, of a prominent Virginia family, represents Culpeper in the Virginia Secession Convention. And I just have a brief excerpt of his speech he made, his preference for secession that he made on March 30th. He voted twice for secession at the first convention on April 4th, but that resolution actually failed. But 2 weeks later, after Fort Sumter is attacked and Lincoln calls for troops, this is to quell the rebellion, the secession convention votes again, and this time it passes. A month later, there's a referendum in the state of Virginia to kind of solidify secession, and a majority being unanimously citizens in Culpeper vote to secede. So that's 1,051 yeas, 0 nays. The same day that Virginia secedes from the Union, Robert Grayson will enlist in the 13th Virginia Infantry. He'll end up serving in 3 different Confederate units from different times during the war. He ends the war serving with John Mosby and his band of partisan irregulars. And he actually gets captured with some of them near Upperville in the spring of 1864. Spends the rest of the war in the old Capitol prison. But before he ends up as a prisoner of war, he will return periodically to Salubria to manage it and its finances, which, as I kind of hearkened to earlier, aren't doing very good and haven't gotten any better. The largest indication of this is that he immediately hires out more than half of his enslaved workers to Richmond at the beginning of the war because the city was very starved for labor, so he got some money for doing that. Culpeper, you see, is going to war, but the war is soon going to come back to Culpeper. So I have this map here, right? And all these red dots symbolize a battle in the Civil War, right? And Culpeper is right here. There's a whole lot of battles, as everyone here knows, as you know, living in the battlefield of the wilderness. Culpeper and this region are basically halfway between Washington and Richmond, the 2 capitals, but they're linked by a railroad. The Rappahannock River will serve as a defensive line, which is somewhere over here, as well as the Rapidan River. And so this high concentration of battles is occurring in this corridor here. And of course, battles just don't happen by themselves. They're fought by armies. And the presence of these armies, especially the Union Army, come with a whole host of complications that would eventually change the way the war is going to be fought. As we know, on paper, with the start of the Civil War, the United States was fighting a war for Union. They were going to leave the Southerners' property, I say without quotes, intact, which of course includes enslaved individuals. This policy becomes much harder to enforce once the U.S. armies actually enter the South. It quickly becomes clear to the soldiers, to the generals, that this war for Union is going to be intricately tied to ending slavery, even before that's officially the case. And we're all familiar with the Emancipation Proclamation. In history class, at least in my experience, we didn't spend a whole lot of time on the Civil War, and it's the Emancipation Proclamation is the end-all be-all, right? It's like, oh, the war's for Union, and then suddenly it's for emancipation, which is a huge simplification, and I never want to discount the importance of the Emancipation Proclamation, but the process of emancipation was happening on the ground from very near the war's beginning. In May of 1861, Fortress Monroe, which is down on the Virginia Peninsula, remained in federal hands, even though the land around it was Confederate controlled. Confederates were building fortifications and trenches to prevent any federal incursions of the peninsula, which was largely done using slave labor. On May 23rd, 3 men, Frank Baker, James Townsend, and Shepard Mallory, there were 3 enslaved men working on these fortifications. They escaped and they ran to Fort Monroe for safety. And this action sets forth a whole ripple effect, forcing the U.S. Army to confront its relationship with slavery. The next day, a Confederate major arrived at the fort and demanded that its commander, Benjamin Butler, return the enslaved men, as it was currently the policy of the U.S. Army not to interfere with the institution as it existed. Butler, he was a political general, he was an astute politician and lawyer. He used the Confederate notion that enslaved people were property against them. He would not, in fact, return Baker, Townsend, and Mallory because they were being used to wage war against the United States by constructing these fortifications. So his logic was, if these people are indeed property, as the Confederates say they are, you wouldn't return something like a musket that you seized from the enemy. You wouldn't return a horse or a cannon. These are contraband. These are things that are being used to wage war against you. Why would you give them back? And so that's Butler's logic here. And so Baker, Townsend, and Mallory start the ball rolling on Union emancipation policy. Butler reacts and forces other federal authorities to act. From this moment on, it's confirmed to enslaved people across the South that the presence of federal soldiers could be an opportunity to self-emancipate. Do you want me to? Oh, you're good, okay. At Fort Monroe, thousands of former enslaved people, men, women, and children, flocked to the Sally Port of the fort to claim their freedom. The New York Times described this phenomenon. The slaves are running away from their masters in troops. It is but the fulfillment of the prophecies of the loss which would be entailed upon the southern states, and especially Virginia, if secession were carried to a bloody issue. Enslavers soon found it hard to maintain discipline and keep up pre-war production, especially as many white men went off to war. And these were the people who would work at overseers or advanced slave patrols, so you kind of lose this system of enforcement. In early spring of 1862, a soldier in the 3rd Pennsylvania Reserves remarked that there were, quote, but very few white people in central Virginia. The presence of U.S. Army also gave enslaved people newfound authority. Some of them even demanded wages from their enslavers. Imagine that. In Fredericksburg, for example, Betty Herndon Morey wrote in her diary in the spring of 1862, matters are getting worse and worse in here every day with regard to the Negroes. They're leaving their owners by the hundred and demanding wages. She then recounts an instance where an enslaver decided to pay wages to his enslaved people, but then everyone in Fredericksburg reacts, and they regard this as setting a most dangerous precedent. Congress would eventually solidify Butler's decision at Fort Monroe into policy by August with the first Confiscation Act. And this allows the federal government to, quote, confiscate slaves of disloyal enslavers being used to wage war against the United States. While this is a really crucial first step, the policy is unequally enforced by commanders on the ground depending on what their ideologies or beliefs were. Some continued to return escaped enslaved people, practicing the limited war philosophy. On the other hand, some wholeheartedly bought into it. Rufus Dawes, who we hear from a couple times in this presentation because he just has a great war diary of the 6th Wisconsin, writes about an enslaver who arrived at Union lines to recapture his slave, who, quote, made good to his title of liberty by taking refuge with the soldiers. Dawes says that the enslaver is, quote, handled roughly and tossed out of camp. The Army further clarified this policy by instituting articles of war prohibiting the return of slaves in March 1862. Yet there's still mixed emotions among the generals and the rank and file. Even still, John Pope, soon to be commander of the Army of Virginia, would write, my slides got a little out of order. I'm not sure what happened there. War had necessarily given the death blow to slavery. Wherever the Union armies move, the old system of master and slave falls. The U.S. Army weren't the only ones working practically towards emancipating enslaved people. In April, the District of Columbia formally abolished slavery, and by turning the nation's capital into a safe haven for freedom, just across the Potomac River from Virginia, it became even easier for enslaved people in Virginia to self-emancipate. And it would become even easier when the Union Army arrived in Fredericksburg on Good Friday, April 18th, 1862. This contingent of Union soldiers made up the Department of the Rappahannock, which was created a few weeks prior. It consisted of the area of Virginia east of the Blue Ridge, west of the Potomac River, the Fredericksburg and Richmond Railroad, including the District of Columbia and the country between the Potomac and the Patuxent rivers. The 1st Army Corps of the Army of the Potomac was detached and made up the core of the Department of the Rappahannock, and it was commanded by a man named Irvin McDowell, who you may know from the Battle of First Bull Run. Pictured here is a group of soldiers from the 7th Wisconsin, from the famous Iron Brigade in Falmouth, just across the river from Fredericksburg. Fredericksburg in 1860 was home to about 5,000 people, and of those, about 1,800 were enslaved. The region of Central Virginia was more densely populated with enslaved people than most other regions. So when Union soldiers arrived to this area in the spring of 1862, they were immediately brought face to face with what is called practical slavery, slavery in the flesh. They had read about it in newspapers, read of Uncle Tom's Cabin. They had never seen it in person. And for many, even those who would have considered themselves abolitionists, slavery was an abstraction, right? Many who weren't abolitionists were apathetic about the institution or even hostile to the notion that it was the Army's job to end it. But seeing it firsthand changed many a mind. It was also clear that enslaved people were anything but apathetic. A New York soldier wrote that, quote, "A venerable old man said, 'We're mighty glad to see you, gentlemen. Been expecting you a long time. The more of you we see, the gladder we are.'" Edward Aldrich, serving in the 2nd U.S. Sharpshooters, recalled an enslaved woman who came up to him and said she had been waiting all her life for us to come, and she thanked the Lord that we had come at last. Frederick Dennison, a trooper in the 1st Rhode Island Cavalry, described these powerful scenes as, quote, "a moral spectacle that forever changed many of the soldiers who encountered it. From then on, many Union soldiers became abolitionists and determined to end the institution of slavery." These jubilations were part of a massive and immediate flood of freedom seekers as they crossed the Rappahannock River into Union lines. And they came at such a rate that even if they wanted to, Union forces probably couldn't have turned them away. Oliver McAllister of the 35th New York remarked that the slaveholders will not have 1/20th part of their slaves left if this army should stay here for weeks. The Union Army will arrive in Culpeper proper a little while later. On May 4th, there was a federal cavalry raid, and then in July, McDowell's 1st Corps enters the town to occupy it. Yet, even though they weren't in Culpeper proper, the Union Army's proximity across the Rappahannock River, 40 miles from Fredericksburg, made escape not only enticing but possible. And just a brief story that illustrates just one of this flood of freedom seekers. If you're familiar with Fredericksburg Civil War history, you may be familiar with the man named, have up here, John Washington. He was enslaved in Fredericksburg and describes that fateful April morning. "Every manservant was out on the housetop looking over the river at the Yankees, for their glistening bayonets could easily be seen. I could not begin to express my newborn hopes, for I felt already like I was certain of my freedom now." And later that day, Washington and several other enslaved men went opposite the Union camps on the Rappahannock River, and Washington would be the first to swim across to what he described as his first night of freedom. Many others, of course, would follow. And if you may be familiar with this famous photograph, taken of a family of refugees fording the Rappahannock River near Cow Ford, which is in Culpeper County near Remington. A New York soldier would write that, quote, "The track of the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad is full of freedom seekers on their way to Washington. You ask them where they came from, and they will tell you, over the river." The superintendent of the U.S. Military Railroad estimated that the number of freedom seekers passing by to be about 10,000. Many would head north towards Alexandria and Washington, where so-called contraband camps were being hastily erected. Some would stay behind to be paid laborers in Union camps. None of this is to say that emancipation and escape were easy. It was largely unattached young men leaving everything behind for a very uncertain future. Austin Holden, a soldier in the 22nd New York, wrote about 3 enslaved men who, quote, "laid out in the woods beyond Union lines for 6 weeks, waiting for the chance to get within our lines. A woman who was enslaved in Orange County fled with 6 children, 3 of her own and 3 of her previously deceased sisters. She fell twice on the way, injuring the baby she carried so severely that it died after reaching Alexandria. There's no guarantee that once they reached, a contraband camp, they would be safe. Disease ran rampant, often in these camps. Conditions were rough, and some were subjected to racism prevalent even among Union soldiers. All of this was further complicated by the counter-reaction of enslavers who were watching this happen, watching their entire livelihood crumble around them. Many had convinced themselves that their slaves would remain loyal during the war. They believed that their enslaved were either too docile to rebel or that they loved their masters too much. Yet, the arrival of the Union Army and then subsequent self-emancipations challenged this notion really severely. If given the chance, many enslaved people would choose to run. It was a struggle that many enslavers struggled to reconcile their long-held beliefs with their slaves' current behaviors. So they often took measures to prevent their enslaved people from going to freedom, and these measures were often very cruel. James Oakes, who is a historian of the anti-slavery movement, writes that the slaveholders themselves were often the first line of defense against military emancipation. And military emancipation refers to what I've largely been talking about, the U.S. Army's presence, where it disrupts slavery wherever the Army goes, and giving enslaved people the opportunity to escape. And then a brief side note, I just want to clarify, emancipation is different from abolition. Emancipation refers to the act of actually freeing people on the ground. But in this case, at this point in the war, slavery as an institution still exists. And it would need to be abolished to guarantee that these people wouldn't go back into slavery once the war was over. And many enslavers tried convincing their slaves that they would be treated poorly or even worse by the Union, or sold off to Cuba, or any number of horrible fates. A woman enslaved in Orange County reported that her enslaver, Jeremiah Morton, of whose family we get Morton's Ford, declared that he would put his enslaved people in a barn and burn them all up before he would let them go free. Some even held enslaved women's children as hostages or threatened reprisals against families of those who ran away. One particularly common tactic, especially those enslavers that had wealth and means, was relocating their slaves. James Oakes writes that the, quote, simplest and most effective way to thwart emancipation was to, quote, refugee the slaves, moving them away from enemy lines and out of the way of an advancing Union Army. For wealthy masters who owned more than one plantation, refugeeing could be relatively simple, however painful for the slaves. But many enslavers weren't concerned with the well-being of their enslaved people. An enslaver in Savannah, Georgia, writing about refugeeing her slaves into the interior of the state, declared that it is we or they who must suffer. Robert Grayson, now to go back to Salubria, he decided to relocate 16, quote, less productive enslaved people, so women and children, to Amherst, as he writes it, to bring them to safety. This was April of 1862. We know exactly what he meant by that. He makes an arrangement with a Mr. Richardson, who also shows up as Richardson, Ratchison. I'm going to use Richardson, but there are different variations of spelling. Who lives in Amherst County, which is down near Lynchburg, which is over here. Culpeper is up here, and then this is Amherst County. There's Blue Ridge, so this is in the Appalachian Mountains. Robert has to hire an ox team, 4 horses, and 2 horse wagons for an 8-day period at a cost of about $245. And this is no small change, especially for a man who, as I've mentioned already, is already struggling financially. In the spring of 1862, Caroline, Rachel, Betty, the 3 women, and children Oleg, Nat, Maria, Sidney, James, Ned, Julia, Nancy, Mary, Alice, Margaret, Moses, Jerry, and Francis are relocated from Salubria, their home, to an unfamiliar plantation in the Appalachian Mountains 120 miles away. And at this point, the records aren't entirely clear as to where exactly they ended up. But based on the research I have done, this is my best educated guess based on what I know right now. And so this is my slides are in a different order than I have my notes. This is a modern photo of Amherst County. This is kind of the terrain we're talking about, mountainous, a little bit more rugged than the Piedmont of Culpeper. So it's very different than what these people would have known. So where did they end up? We know that a Jesse Richardson bought 2,000 acres of land near the Peddler River in western Amherst County in the early 19th century. In 1850, 39 enslaved people worked there. And this whole deep dive surprised me because I was of the notion that slavery didn't really exist in the mountains. It was just, it didn't work, the land wasn't as fertile there. But that's really not the case, and it really surprised me. In the early 18th century, late 18th century, many newcomers to the Appalachian Blue Ridge region as Europeans pushed west wanted to basically be Virginia planters in the Tidewater, but in the mountains. So they first relied on indentured servitude, but this soon gave way to African slavery. And these planters amassed large amounts of land that could be worked. Jesse Richardson was one of these people. He had a large farming operation as well as a grist and sawmill on the river there. Jesse died in 1855, and his properties were split among his sons. Son William received the, quote, rocky road track and, quote, nothing more, and then his other son, his younger son Samuel, younger than William, buys his farm and mill. And then this map here, which I kind of glossed over, kind of shows you the modern route to where I think they would have ended up in Amherst. This is about a 3-hour drive today, obviously much longer without the advent of cars. So I mentioned earlier, it's unclear where exactly the Salubria enslaved people ended up, but my guess is that it's this property that I'm about to show you here. This is a 1850s map of Amherst, and then when I zoomed in, so this is up here near this big ink blot, there's a Richard, it's spelled Richardson on here, but it's interchangeable, and so that's most likely, based on my guess, the plot of land where they ended up. Payments for the slaves' board and supplies are billed to an S. Richardson. But I just deduced that this is Samuel's land that was purchased from his father. He actually purchased his father's mill tract as well. So Grayson paid for things like bacon, leather, medicine, clothing, and shoes for the enslaved people he had boarded in Amherst. At one point, Grayson actually has to pay for a coffin, as unfortunately little Sydney, one of the children, passed away after an illness shortly after arriving there. And so Robert will pay for the 15 remaining people through the end of 1864. It's unclear. You may be asking yourself, why this family? Why the Richardsons? And that's a question I'm still asking. I still don't fully understand how he came to know this family. It's a research rabbit hole I haven't quite fully gone down yet. I hope to eventually, but we do know that Robert marries Samuel's niece and William's daughter, Virginia, in December of 1863. Now, what happened to the enslaved people that were here? They were relocated to Amherst County, but what happened when the war ended? Did they attempt to go home to find their family in Culpeper? Did they stay in Amherst? And again, another question I'm still trying to piece together, and I can tell you maybe my best guess. So, I can tell you what happened to the land where these plantations were. When Jesse Richardson was still alive, so he's the patriarch of the family who buys the land, he apparently fathered at least one child with one of his enslaved people. His name was Mose, and according to oral history, he was allowed to work the mill for a wage. By the end of the war, he had actually saved up enough money to purchase the land and the mill, most likely in the late 1860s. This property transformed into a thriving freedmen's community after the war, where many newly emancipated slaves would live and work as sharecroppers. A lot of what is known about this community, which is known as the Brown Mountain Creek Freedmen Settlement, comes from a man named Taft Hughes, who's photographed here. His parents lived there in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and he describes the experience of sharecropping that his parents worked for in that quote there. This system of sharecropping started to change in the early 20th century. The city of Lynchburg was actually looking for a new fresh water supply at this point because the James River had become way too polluted. And they turned to this other river, the Peddler River, which is where all of this land is situated around. The city acquires the land, and I'm not sure if it's purchased or acquired through eminent domain, but nonetheless they construct a reservoir by damming the Peddler River. And this floods the mill site and adjoining lands, and descendants of Mose Richardson sell the rest of their land to the Forest Service in 1919. And now it's part of George Washington and Jefferson National Forest, and the Appalachian Trail actually runs right through the former community site. And so this is a picture of the dam that is now at the mill site. And this is actually a hiking map from the George Washington Jefferson National Forest. And there's a whole, they mark the site of the freed slaves community. There's actually waysides along the Appalachian Trail as well. So this kind of gives you the lay of the land as it currently stands. I had a lot of trouble as I was investigating this because it looks so different than it would have in the 1860s. Before the reservoir is created and the river is dammed. It took me a lot of matching maps to try to figure it out. There are still foundations of freedmen's houses that litter the area, and there's waysides that detail the lives of people who used to live there. Perhaps some of these people, again, this is nothing I've confirmed officially, but perhaps these included the 16 people who were forcibly relocated from Salubria. Ironically enough, in 2007, there was a drought in Lynchburg, and so the mill site actually was visible because the water receded so much. So there's a photograph of this. So back to the larger story at hand. This whole situation there's an elephant in the room here. It reeks of irony. Grayson is so afraid that the Union Army will cause his enslaved people to run away that he removes them over 100 miles away to another plantation. He pays for the move, he pays for oxen and a cart, and he also pays board for them, for their food, their supplies, for the next 2.5 years. All the while, they are not providing Grayson any of the free labor that would have been the whole point of having enslaved people to begin with. And I think this whole situation, at least the larger picture for me, is exposing this contradiction embedded within the institution of slavery. That this is a very upside down way of thinking. And also turns the whole narrative of the loyal slave up on its head, right? Because if you were so content thinking that your enslaved people were loyal and not going to run away, why would you move them 120 miles away, go through all of that effort? The First Corps and the soldiers of the Department of Rappahannock didn't stay here forever, obviously, we know that. They left the region in September of 1862 to confront the Confederate invasion of Maryland. After they left, there were attempts by local pro-Confederate authorities to revert the old power dynamics of master and slave, but it was often too little too late. These changes were often impossible to put back. To come back to Rufus Dawes again, he really succinctly describes this phenomenon. When I found this quote, I was like, this is literally perfect. It is exactly what I needed. He is a great diary, so I highly recommend you check it out as well. No system of abolition could have swept the system away more effectively than does the advance of our army. Behind us, the slaves, if they choose, are free. Confronting this moral spectacle turned many apathetic soldiers into active emancipators. And it was becoming clear to all, from all the way up in the halls of Congress down to the camps of the armies, that the destruction of slavery was crucial to the war effort. and the war could not be won with slavery still intact. It is important to note that many enslaved people had come to this realization even before the war began. They realized that Lincoln's election could potentially spell the doom of slavery. And the formerly enslaved people who did... Okay. Where to go? The formerly enslaved people who took the chance to run to Union lines, they would prove invaluable to the war effort. They would provide crucial intelligence, served as spies. John Washington actually served as a spy. He was the man from Fredericksburg that self-emancipated in 1862. He actually led Union officials into the city of Fredericksburg and pointed out notorious secessionists, and then Union officials arrested those secessionists. That happened all across the South. These formerly enslaved people also worked as laborers, as cooks, as laundresses in camps, like these gentlemen here, which is taking the winter encampment in Culpeper County. And all these actions, of course, are going to benefit the Union cause. This goes hand in hand with each self-emancipation, with each refusal to work, with each demanding of wages. The system of slavery was disrupted. And this was the system that sustained the Confederacy, its armies, and its home front. Realizing this, now that it's become obvious, on July 17, 1862, Congress passed the Second Confiscation Act, which is fully known as an act to suppress insurrection, to punish treason and rebellion, to seize and confiscate the property of rebels and for other purposes. This act formalizes what's largely happening on the ground anyways, but it's now enshrined in U.S. law. It essentially freed all slaves of disloyal enslavers who were currently waging war against the United States. This act also had a not-so-secret weapon. It gave the president the power to issue an Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all slaves in disloyal areas. And we know that the Emancipation Proclamation was not issued in July of 1862, largely to do with the way the Union war effort was going. Lincoln waited until a Union victory, which came on September 17th alongside Antietam Creek, as we know. 5 days later, on September 22nd, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that on January 1st, 1863, all slaves in areas currently in rebellion would be free. Just 1 second here. And in my time as a public historian, I've seen a lot of people, my colleagues especially, some of them, try to discount the impact of the proclamation. That's true. It didn't free a single slave. I guess you could say that. But notwithstanding that, this is Lincoln coming out saying to the whole world that this war is about emancipation. Victory and freedom for 4 million Americans are now intertwined. No foreign power would ever come to the aid of a country explicitly fighting to perpetuate human bondage at this point. And this changed everything. Lincoln realized this, congressmen realized this, U.S. soldiers realized this, and of course, enslaved people recognized this. Confederates also recognized this. They reacted harshly. This was the fulfillment of every white Southerner's nightmare. It was basically the culmination of a slave insurrection to them. Jefferson Davis called the Emancipation Proclamation the most execrable measure recorded in the history of guilty man. Robert E. Lee referred it to as a savage and brutal policy that left Confederates with no alternative but success or degradation worse than death. This sentiment trickled down to local communities like Culpeper. Anger, fear, and racism became intertwined in one of the deadliest concoctions. The New York Times reported an incident in October of 1862 in Culpeper. Greatest consternation imagined among the whites in that section, Culpeper, in consequence of an apprehended Negro revolt. 17 Negroes, most of them free, had been hung. Copies of late Northern newspapers found upon them containing President Lincoln's proclamation to liberate the slaves. The terror of the whites is believed to be beyond description. The inhabitants of the counties where the insubordination exists threatened to resist the Conscription Act on the plea of self-defense to protect themselves. The Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect on January 1st, and there's no going back. This is it. There's no going back to the Union as it was. Now the U.S. fought for a Union as they thought it should be, a Union without slavery. attitudes and resolves on both sides are going to harden, and the war itself becomes hardened, as we know, as standing in the middle of the wilderness battlefield. This becomes even more of a case due to one of the provisions of the Emancipation Proclamation, which is the provision for raising of black soldiers. There had been some, unofficial groups of black soldiers already, but this makes it official. Starting in May of 1863, black soldiers are seeing combat at places like Milliken's Bend, Fort Hudson, and Fort Wagner. Over 180,000 black soldiers will fight throughout the rest of the war. And Alonzo Quint, who is the chaplain of the 2nd Massachusetts Infantry, remarks that we could make the South tremble by the statement, "Your slaves shall be free, and they shall help conquer you." By the spring of 1864, there's an entire division of United States colored troops in the Army of the Potomac, the 4th Division of the 9th Army Corps. On May 5th, 1864, thousands of these men enter Culpeper County at Kelly's Ford. These men include some of whom had escaped from slavery in Culpeper County. So that had to have been a profound homecoming. After a brief stay in Culpeper, these troops began marching south across the Rapidan River to join the overland campaign. The day was hot, and behind the path of the advancing army were hundreds of stragglers in blue who were overcome by heat and thirst. Three of those men belonged to the 4th Division of USCTs. They fell behind somewhere near Maddern's Tavern, which is 3 miles to the east of Salubria. So that's to the west of us here, across the Rapidan River in Culpeper. These men were soon captured by Company B of the 9th Virginia Cavalry, and there it should have ended. They shouldn't become prisoners of war. But they weren't. They didn't simply become prisoners of war. Bird Willis, who's a soldier in this unit, describes what happens next kind of chillingly matter-of-factly. "We captured 3 Negro soldiers. The first we had seen, they were taken out to the roadside and shot, and their bodies left there." And if you're familiar with this incident at all, so this is kind of showing where this happened in regards to Salubria, there's now a monument there commemorating this incident by the Freedom Foundation. This was dedicated back in 2021. And so Madden's Tavern, of course, is an antebellum tavern founded by Willis Madden, who's a free black man. It still stands today as part of the larger Maddensville historic site. And just across the street is Ebenezer Baptist Church, which is one of the earliest churches in Virginia founded by free people after the Civil War. And so this crossroads here, right, you have Madden's Tavern on one side, the Baptist Church, and this monument kind of speak very loudly about the progression of and experiences of black Americans during, before, and after the Civil War. And so when I originally gave this presentation in December, I kind of used this incident to show how the war was becoming more intense, attitudes were hardening. But as I did more research into the Richardson family, I found kind of a really shocking coincidence here. And it kind of speaks to kind of this full circle, how deep the effort to preserve slavery really went. So just bringing this map back, this is Culpeper, about where Salubria is. This is Amherst, where that plantation was. And so the Richardson family, who I talked about earlier, that's where Robert Grayson sent his enslaved people to for safekeeping, and who Robert married into a year later. Turns out Robert's father-in-law, William, who was the brother of Samuel, where the plantation was, had joined the 9th Virginia Cavalry, Company B, and was serving with them at the time of the massacre of the USCTs. About 120 miles separate these two spots on the map. Robert sent his enslaved people there to get them away from the war. And yet, from Amherst, 100 miles away from the fighting, comes William to join the war effort. And he most likely participates in this egregious act of violence that symbolizes the way the war is changing. Merely 3 miles from Salubria. And when I came across that, I was just like, there's no way. the full circle, the way this war, we talk about this, how large this war is, how many people impacts, but it's also very small. It's very personal. And so this violent conclusion to my story is just one event in this fraught, often changing situation of emancipation on the ground. It's not cut and dry. It's not Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, everybody was free, and they all lived happily ever after. That's not how it happened. That's not how history works. Power dynamics were upended and then put back, often violently, against enslaved and free black people. Came at a cost, of course, for hundreds of thousands of Union troops who died and suffered and were wounded, as well as for the countless freedom seekers who left behind everything they knew for an uncertain, but hopefully, not always, free future. These two different actors, the U.S. soldiers and then the freedom seekers, both tangentially together created a situation where freedom could be sought, and then it also caused a significant dramatic shift in policy that ultimately decided what this country would look like when the war ended, and that we would be a country without slavery. And this whole story, I kind of came across this on accident when I was looking through some of Salubria's records. Long story short, there's a lawsuit after the Civil War where Robert Grayson is sued by his brother because he never paid him back for his loan. And it's this 100-page document, and there's lots of family drama in it. But in the midst of it, there are receipts and accounts of Salubria's Civil War expenses. And so within this, there is, a horse and oxen to send 16 people to safety in Amherst. And it's what does that mean? What does that mean? And so looking into the context for this, the larger story, really shows how history is not linear, how it's always changing, how it's also very connected. History is not linear, but progress is also not linear, and nothing is guaranteed. We live, it seems, always in unprecedented times, right? And I think knowing that it was always unprecedented times, people back in these times where we look back and oh, that resolved. Oh, okay, it worked out in the end. They didn't know it was going to work out in the end. So I always like to use that as sort of a, comforting train of thought. It's always been confusing. History is always happening around us. And so I'll leave you with a question: is how do we continue the work of these people, of the U.S. soldiers like Rufus Dawes, of the enslaved freedom seekers, and how do we make sure that the sacrifices of people like this unidentified USCT family were not in vain? So there's a question slide. Yeah. Thank you very much for having me today. And if you have any questions.
I have a question regarding the Underground Railroad. In all of your time in your research, did you ever come across any indication that the Underground Railroad was active in Culpeper County?
Based on what I know, I would say not in the official capacity like it was in the North, where you had, stops and people who were part of this network. I would say using Underground Railroad as a larger, if we consider any site that was kind of important to the movement of enslaved people to the North, maybe. But I wouldn't say anything officially, Underground Railroad. But important to freedom seekers, yes, absolutely. Yes.
Where is Madden Town?
Yeah, Maddensville. We'll go back to that slide. Maybe. Okay. So this is Route 3. This is Lignum, which is 8 miles to the west. And then right before you get to Lignum, there's a road that goes to the right here. I don't know what the name of the road is off the top of my head. Yeah, I think that, yeah.
Well, actually.
No, it's before Carico, I think.
It is.
I think it's Madden Road.
Yeah, somewhat.
So it's off to the north of Route 3, and then this is Stevensburg here. There's a road that kind of goes like here, this direction, for lack of a better word. But if you search USDT Monument or Madden or Ebenezer Baptist Church, that's right where this is.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Where is this, where did you locate this lawsuit between the resident?
Yeah, so I will not take full credit for that. We have Historic Germanna is very lucky to have she's a former board member, a local historian who's kind of took it up as her pandemic project to compile everything we know about Salubria, and she had this as part of her compilation. And I think it's digitized. I don't know what website it is, Virginia, some sort of legal website, and the whole thing is digitized. It's not transcribed. But the important pages have been already transcribed. I did not do that because it's very hard to read, but it's all online, all digitized, which is helpful because as someone who graduated college during COVID, I am more comfortable doing online research than going to archives. So I'm still learning how to actually go into an archive and do research. But digital resources like this lawsuit have been really good to have. I'd have to check what the actual website is. But anyone has anything else? Thank you again for welcoming me back after I flaked on y'all.
Before you go, please remember to visit our website often, civilwarstudygroup.org. We make every attempt on a regular basis to provide informative content. Thank you for visiting, and God bless.